So now that we've discussed what evolution is and natural selection is, what evidence do we have that supports this theory that evolution occurs by common descent or natural selection? There's 4 categories of evidence we're going to look at: the fossil record, biogeographical evidence, anatomical evidence, and biochemical evidence. So let's get into fossil evidence first. What is a fossil, though? Fossils are traces of past life, so remnants that have been encased in amber or rock that we can analyze. They allow us to trace the descent of a particular group of organisms. And for Darwin, he relied on fossils heavily to formulate the theory of evolution. When he was on his travels around the globe, he collected many fossils and brought them back. The key fossils we look for when it comes to providing evidence of evolution are transitional fossils. These are organisms or groups of organisms that have characteristics from 2 different groups. So for example, Tiktaalik, this one we see here, is one of those transitional fossils. Tiktaalik represents this very interesting combination of amphibian and fish. It has scales and fins just like a fish would, but it has expanded ribs, a neck. The eyes are on top of the head just like an early amphibian. In addition to the head, the neck, and the ribs, it also has a shoulder. Tiktaalik is a fish that you could have thought of being able to do a push-up. So it's really this interesting mix, this like amalgamation of 2 different groups. And that shows us that there was a transition that happened from water to land. Tiktaalik was an organism living in that in-between stage in that transition. But we don't just look at Tiktaalik, we can look at the fossil record as a whole. The fossil record tells us that life has progressed from things that were on the simpler side towards more complex. That prokaryotes came first, and we see those in the fossil record, followed by unicellular eukaryotes, and then multicellular eukaryotes. So we went from simple cells that didn't have any organelles to single-celled organisms that did have organelles to multi-celled organisms that have organelles. From the fossil record, we can also determine that fish came before terrestrial plants and animals. So we started in the water and then expanded onto land. We also know that non-flowering plants came first, and then flowering plants evolved from them. We know that amphibians came before reptiles, and we know that dinosaurs are directly linked to birds. So that chicken that you had for dinner, think of it like you ate a relative of a dinosaur. So let's look at some. Here we see another one of those kind of transitions with Archaeopteryx, where we see it looks very dinosaur-like. However, it has wings with feathers. It looks somewhat bird-like with the exception of that face, where it has teeth instead of a beak. If we look at these fossils, and again, we know how old these fossils are, so we can put them in order in a timeline. We look at the modern whale down here, where we have these rudimentary hip bones. We'll talk about what those are in a little bit. And as we go back millions of years, we see that those hip bones become less and less rudimentary and more functional. So it shows us that over time, we saw the legs kind of degrading back and becoming less and less usable. We saw that the nostrils shifted back to become the blowhole on the modern whale. So we look at all of these anatomical changes to create these links from modern organisms to those within the fossil record. For biogeographical evidence, we're looking and studying the distribution of plants and animals throughout the entire world. And when we look at the evidence we see in biogeography, it really supports the hypothesis that organisms originate in one spot and then can spread out. And we find that there's different life forms from wherever geography separates them. A really good example of this are islands. Because islands are geographically isolated, they have very many unique life forms because there's no interbreeding that happens from the island to either another island or the mainland. They've had a lot of time to accumulate changes that other areas that are not separated geographically, they don't have those uniqueness, that unique difference. A really good example of that would be marsupials. So marsupials are pretty much limited to Australia. Right? There really aren't any others anywhere else. And yet we do see some similarities that pop up between the marsupials of Australia and the mammals that we find all around the globe. Our third one is anatomical evidence. The common descent hypothesis offers a plausible explanation of why we see anatomical similarities among living organisms. And one of those primary pieces of evidence is the homologous structure. These are structures that are anatomically similar, that are inherited from a common ancestor. So for example, vertebrate forelimbs, the arms, so to speak, of vertebrates. Analogous structures serve the same function, but they don't have a common ancestry, and so the construction for those structures are not the same. For example, the wings of a bird and the wings of an insect. Both wings provide flight, however, the wing of a bird has feathers and skin and muscle, whereas the wing of an insect is more of like a thin, semi-translucent membrane. And then vestigial structures. This ties us back to the whale we were looking at. These are anatomical features that are fully developed in one group, but that have become reduced or have no function in another. So whales do have a pelvic girdle and legs, but it's been reduced down to the point where it's completely non-functional, and that if you were looking at the whale from the outside, you wouldn't even notice them. You'd have to dissect that whale in order to find those components. Let's look at the homologous structures, since those ones really do provide us some good key evidence that shows that these organisms have a common ancestor from their past. So if we look at the wing of a bird, of a bat, the flipper of a whale, the leg of a cat, of a horse, and the arm of a human, all of these structures, these forelimbs, are going to perform different functions, and on the outside they do look very different. They've been modified for very specific purposes. Right? The human arm is modified for grasping and grabbing and carrying. The horse and the cat are modified for running on four legs. The whales modified for swimming, and the bird and bat modified for flight. But if we strip them down to the skeletal component, we find that there is a key trait linking all of these together, and that comes down to the patterning of the bones. In all of these organisms, we have a humerus, which would be the upper arm. We have a radius and ulna, which are part of the forearm. We have the metacarpals, which form the wrist, and the phalanges, which are the fingers. Now in every single one of these, they've been stretched and squished or modified in some way, but the pattern is still there. One bone, two bones, lots of bones, digits. That pattern is repeated in the bird, the bat, the whale, the cat, the horse, and the human. We also see homologous structures in vertebrate embryos. If you look very, very early in development, for example, right here we're looking at a pig embryo and a chick embryo. If I didn't have those labels on there, you probably wouldn't be able to tell them apart very well. You might not realize that they were even that vastly different. Because the earlier you go in development, the more and more similar we look. Those similarities tell us that there is some sort of evolutionary relationship there, that these early structures started off in a common ancestor, and then as we diverged and became different species, we simply modified those structures during the developmental process. And lastly, we get to a biochemical evidence. When we look at living things and we look at the biochemistry of them, it's identical. We all use DNA when it comes to storing our genetic information. We all use ATP to help power our chemical reactions that happen in our body. We all use the same triplicate genetic code, meaning 3 nucleotides gives us a codon, and that codon tells us which amino acid to use. And we all use the same 20 amino acids to build our proteins. Many of the genes that we have are also the same. If we look at the genetic code between one human and another, it's almost completely identical. Very little's different. When we look at our genetic code compared to the chimpanzee, it's more different than it would be from one person to another, but it's still very similar. Even the DNA between us and a banana is remarkably similar, up to 50%. So this tells us that there is a link. There is a common ancestor that helped form and develop these processes and these molecules. The fact that we all use these proteins using these same amino acids, that we store our DNA the same way, that we power our reactions the same way, is a powerful link, bringing all of life together as one family. Let's look at an example of this. Cytochrome C is a protein that we use in our mitochondria when it comes to making ATP. And if we look at the gene and then we look at the protein cytochrome C, we see that from one human to another, there's no difference. We all have the same cytochrome C. If we look at us compared to a monkey, there is a 2 amino acid difference between our cytochrome C and their cytochrome C. And the further we get away from the pig to the duck to the turtle to the fish to the moth to the yeast, we see that we accumulate more and more differences between them, the more and more unrelated we are to that organism. And yet, we still share this protein, albeit somewhat altered, between ourselves and yeast. Something that I'm sure when you look in your pantry and you make your banana bread, you're not looking at your yeast and thinking, this is one of my distant cousins. And yet, you still both use the same kind of protein for the same kind of function, with just some differences between the two.